بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا صلوات. واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. ربي أرني الحق حقا فأتبعه والباطل باطلا فأجتنبه ولا تجعله متشابها علي فأتبع هواي بغير علم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Holy Quran, and what he says is the truth. In the chapter of Quran, chapter 49, verse 13, Allah says, Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, in the chapter of Al-Hujurat, verse 13, he says, O people, surely we created you as male and female and made you tribes and nations so that you may become acquainted with one another. Surely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most gracious is of you are those who are most pious. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. As we go through these trying times of the coronavirus, as we see the workers who were considered to be non-essential at one point and easily replaceable by corporations, becoming probably the most essential in society, because without them we wouldn't be able to eat, we wouldn't be able to live. After seeing that there are those leaders who have shown their bravery and their selflessness and their ability to manage affairs during times of crisis, and as we see those who unfortunately have fallen from being heroes to being zeros, by showing their selfishness, their inability to have empathy towards others, and their staunch and brazen acts that cause them to become hated by others, while others who might not have been seen before, those who might not have been considered before, those who were perhaps unsung heroes today in these times of sacrifice, they have come to the forefront, rising above all to become heroes. So the question is then, how is it that one becomes a hero? How is it that others are doomed to fail and become zeros? And that is why today the topic of our lecture is heroes versus zeros. Because our goal in life is truly to become heroes in our own right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects that of us, because a hero is one who has perfected themselves. But what is the quintessential characteristic that must exist within a hero? And this is what we want to look at today. We'll look at this topic from a logical perspective, and then from a psychological perspective. And finally, we'll look at it from an Islamic perspective. So let's get started. Now we know first and foremost, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unlimited. He is the creator of all things. And creators, as we said before, are not limited by their creations, and therefore the creator of all of limitation himself must be unlimited, which means that he's all perfect, which means that he's indeficient, he doesn't have any flaws. And therefore that means then that he is all purposeful, and that I have a purpose, and everything that I go through has a purpose. And the greatest purpose that I have is to show my gratitude to my Lord, first and foremost, for bringing me to this world. And the greatest purpose that any trial and tribulation has is to perfect me and to bring me closer to him, if I am able to rise above it, to realize its role in my own perfection. That each one of these struggles, in actual fact, is only a stepping stone that brings me to a higher level, a higher plane, a higher state of existence and transcendence. Once I make that realization, what happens is that every struggle that I face now becomes a challenge that is tailor-made for me and for no one else. Now, what does that mean? That means that once I make that realization, I look ahead towards the challenges that are coming. I prepare myself for the challenges that are in my life. Once they come into existence in my life, what happens is I am able to rise to the occasion. Why? Because I am more able to understand the role of this trial and tribulation in my life. And so it becomes easier for me to make choices in this trial and tribulation. Because you see, the last trial and tribulation I went through made me stronger. Because now I am stronger, I'm more able to understand where I fit into the grand scheme of things. You see, once I realized that I have that strength, I also realize that others have weaknesses. And it becomes my role, my social responsibility to be able to take care of those who don't have the same strength that I do. To step up to the plate, to realize that when others don't have food, then it becomes my role to sacrifice and to give others of what I have. Yes, it doesn't mean that I don't eat food, but it means that I share my food, right? If I am able to go out and I am healthy to help others, then I step out of my own circle and I go out and help others. Even though it might mean that I might have to sacrifice my health or my wealth or my well-being. We find, logically speaking, that the greatest people that have been known by humanity are those who have sacrificed themselves. If we look at people, for example, in modern day times, we see people such as Mother Teresa, for example, who was known to have sacrificed everything to help those who are impoverished and destitute in India. We find Gandhi, for example, who sacrificed himself, his profession as a lawyer, his social status. He gave everything up to march for freedom. This is truly sacrifice. We find also Nelson Mandela, who sacrificed his own freedom to be imprisoned for 27 years, only to rise above after he was released, to become a hero to his nation, and to become a hero to all those who believe in freedom and liberty. We find the same thing with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. We find then that those heroes that people know of within society, the society that we live in, they all had one essential characteristic, and that was their ability to sacrifice themselves, their own needs, their own wants, for the greater good of society. Today we find, for example, that people such as governors have really stepped up to the plate. They've risen above even the most powerful person in the country. Why? Because they sacrificed themselves, they sacrificed their time, they sacrificed their time with their family and the well-being of their families. To do what? To serve others, to be in a position to help others. We find, for example, doctors and nurses and healthcare workers, they've sacrificed their own health, their own wealth. Many of them, they can't see their families. I was speaking to someone the other day. She said to me, I work in the ER and I can't return to see my husband or to see my mother or my father or my siblings, while all of us are sitting comfortably at home, able to see our own families. These essential medical workers are unable to do so. We find the same applies to essential workers that work in grocery stores, making food available to all of us. They too are unable to be with their families as a result of their mixing and mingling with people, with others in society. We find then that those who are held at a high status in society are those that rise above their own wants and their own needs. And so it becomes clear to me that in order for me to turn myself from a zero to a hero, there's one quintessential characteristic that I must have, and that has to be sacrifice. Once I realize this, the logical argument becomes clear, and now we're ready to move on to the psychological proof. We find, for example, in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, it suggests that heroes have 12 traits. One, they have moral integrity. Two, they have bravery. Three, they have conviction. Four, they have courage. Five, self-sacrifice. Six, selflessness. Seven, determination. Eight, inspiration. These are only 8 of what they have. In reality, if we read all of these and we look deep into what it says first, they have a moral compass. And that moral to have conviction, dedication, to have courage, and courage requires one to be patient in times of calamity, right? Courage requires that one sacrifices their own needs and wants, and therefore we find that they have a characteristic of self-sacrifice, of selflessness, right? Self-sacrifice and selflessness are essential characteristics. Why? Because without it, you can't be courageous. And without it, you cannot have moral integrity. And without it, you cannot be determined to reach the goals that you want to reach without stepping on others to do so. And therefore, as a result, you become inspirational. In a study done by the University of Missouri that outlines what the qualities of a hero are, the first quality that is mentioned is sacrifice. The second is determination. The third is loyalty. The fourth is courage. The fifth is dedication. The sixth is compassion. The seventh is valor. The eighth is selflessness. The ninth is conviction. The 10th is gallantry. The 11th is perseverance. The 12th is fortitude. 13th is bravery, and the 14th is to find fault or a flaw in oneself. Now, this is quite interesting. The reason why I say it's interesting, it's because what they did was they basically, out of their study, they found these characteristics, and then they defined what each characteristic actually is. So let's see what they say about sacrifice. It's the forfeiture of something highly valued, greater value or claim. Isn't that interesting? So when a firefighter, for example, runs into a burning building, what has he determined? He's determined that the value of someone else's life is greater than his own life. That's truly sacrifice. We find that when a mother, for example, sacrifices the food on her own plate to give to her child, that in itself is choosing to having the moral fortitude to be able to choose the child over herself, to become selfless by doing so, right? And that comes that no one else can feel other than a mother for her child. We also find that a mother deprives herself of sleep just so that her child can be comfortable at night, to ensure that if he's sick, that he is healed. We find the same moral character exists within healthcare workers, such as doctors and nurses. The second thing that they mention is determination. They say that it's a fixed intention or resolution, a firmness of purpose or resolve. So that means what? That means that determination is dedication, right? A resolution to connect yourself to something that you value and therefore you believe in, and so you become committed to its importance in your life. And so those people that become heroes, what do? They are committed to the greater good. They are committed to others. They recognize the value and worth of others. The next characteristic is loyalty, and they define it as a feeling of allegiance or the act of binding oneself to a course of action. And therefore, being loyal to, for example, your people, as we see with some governors today, their loyalty to their state, right? To their constituents. Medical workers' loyalty to their jobs. They don't just leave their job, right? For fear of infection or for fear of sickness. We see many of them have dropped on the front lines, not because of sickness, no, because not because of the fact that they don't value their work, they fear for themselves, no, but because they were inflicted by the illness and were afraid to inflict others. The loyalty here of the essential workers and their dedication for people and helping people in society when they may not be getting more healthcare benefits, number one, and two, more pay. And that's why we see many of them asking for this themselves in the news. The next characteristic is courage. And it's defined as the firmness of spirit and the swell of the soul, which means that which meets danger without fear, right? So to put yourself in a dangerous situation without fear, to have firmness of spirit, to choose what is right over what is wrong, that in itself is truly courage. And that's what we're seeing today, every day on the front lines by our healthcare workers, by our essential workers. We're also finding that according to the University of Missouri, that dedication is also important. They say dedication is a selfless devotion, complete and wholehearted fidelity, or the act of binding oneself to a course of action. We mentioned before that the logical course that takes us to becoming dedicated to something is that we value it. And when someone values humanity, when someone values freedom, they're willing to give their life to it. When some dedicate themselves to saving others, that means that they see the value of life and the worth of others. The next characteristic is compassion. And compassion, they define it as a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for others who are stricken by misfortune. And that's what we see today. We see the compassion of our healthcare workers. We see the compassion also of our mothers as they take care of their kids. We see the compassion of the essential workers. We see the compassion of these governors who are trying very hard to see things through the eyes of their constituents. It also says it's accompanied by a strong desire or action to alleviate suffering. That's what we see today. The next characteristic is valor. And valor is considered to be the courage that's exhibited in war and cannot be applied to single combat. Valor is something that we're seeing today. We see that there's a medal of valor that is given to those who participate in protecting, for example, the home, right? But we also find that in order for someone to have valor, they must have all of these above characteristics. They must be compassionate. They must be courageous. They must be dedicated to their cause. They must be selfless, right? They must sacrifice. They're even willing to sacrifice their own lives for the greater good. To be selfless is the next characteristic. It's the quality of unselfish concern for the welfare of others. And it's an act of less concern for oneself. So that's how we describe our parents, right? When we describe our parents, we say they were selfless as they raised us, right? They put food on the table. They sacrificed their ambitions for us. Whatever money they made, they put towards us. They slept less so that they can work hard to provide for us. This is truly selflessness, right? Conviction is the next thing. And conviction is very similar to dedication. But conviction is what causes the dedication, right? It's when you value something, you believe in it, now you have this internal intention of being convicted to following or doing something, right? That causes you to act in an act of bravery, right? To act in to have that dedication towards something. And they define it as a fixed or strong belief and necessity of the mind and of an unshakable belief. The next characteristic that they mention is gallantry. Gallantry in Arabic is called muru'ah. Gallantry is defined as an adventurous courage which courts danger and with a high and cheerful spirit. We say that someone has gallantry when they're chivalrous, right? When, let's say, for example, we always hear the story of the person who took off their coat and placed it on the ground so that a woman can walk over it, right? Because there was a puddle or some mud or something. This is someone who has gallantry, right? Someone who is gallant is someone who's considered a knight. If you read the novels out there about, for example, the Knights of the Round Table or that sort of thing, that's usually associated with someone who has gallantry. One can have gallantry without being a knight, of course, right? Because gallantry requires dedication, it requires courage, it requires a certain sense of empathy that you have in order for you to stand up for what is right, to become chivalrous. Perseverance also is the next characteristic. It's a persistence in determination, right? Fortitude is the next one. And fortitude is considered to be passive courage, according to the University of Missouri. And it consists of a habit of encountering danger and enduring pain with a steadfast and unbroken spirit. Another word for fortitude is resilience. When we say moral fortitude, as we mentioned in those studies, psychological studies, moral fortitude is finding that moral base, that moral compass from which everything else comes out, from which everything else blooms, right? Bravery is the next one, and it is a daring and impetuous courage like that of one who has the reward continually in view and displays his courage in daring acts, right? So it's brave of a mother to sacrifice her sleep, to sacrifice her ambitions, to sacrifice her well-being, to protect her child, to ensure that her child can thrive and strive in life. And the same applies to fathers, the same applies to emergency workers, the same applies to doctors and nurses and essential workers we're seeing today. And the last characteristic they mentioned is to have a flaw. And that means then they say a fault often concealed that mars the perfection of someone. This imperfection often causes vulnerability. It's that very vulnerability then that causes the person to have a sense of empathy towards others. When one sees their own faults, they're more able to give of themselves for others. So let's see what Islam says about this, how to become a hero. And now it doesn't tell you specifically in the Holy Quran or in the narrations, you know, how to become a hero 101, okay? But what it does tell you is that Imams, the Holy Quran, our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they give us the essential characteristics in order to become a hero. So what I want to do first is I want to look at, for example, heroes in the Holy Quran. We find, for example, let's start with Prophet Ibrahim as an example, right? We find that he is considered to be a hero of all Semitic religions. Why is that? Because he literally sacrificed himself. Remember, Nimrod or Namrud would actually catapult him into a fire, right? He sacrificed his own well-being in order to show humanity that God exists and that God is important and that they are more worthy, right, of perfection and greatness than to lower themselves by worshiping idols, right? And so we find, for example, in the story of Prophet Ibrahim, him breaking the idols and then standing courageously, right, with moral fortitude in front of the man who raised him and all those around him who were considered to be, you know, the highest and the most socially elevated members of society, that he would stand with moral fortitude, sacrificing his own self in order to prove to humanity that the error of their ways, right? Why? Because he's dedicated to what he values and what he believes in, and that is Allah first and foremost. And as a result, it becomes easier for him to sacrifice, it becomes easier for him to become selfless. You see, all of these things that we came to logically speaking, and that we came to from the psychological studies, is mirrored and reflected here in the actions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us of his prophets in the Holy Quran. We also find that Prophet Ibrahim did something that might blow our minds, right? That a regular human being would find extremely hard and extremely tough to do. After so many years of not being able to have a child, right? After he marries Sarah, his second wife, what does he do, right? He finally is able to have a child. But what does Allah command him to do? He tells him, I want you to take them to this area that today is known as Saudi Arabia, specifically in Mecca. Mecca was nothing at that point, right? It was a dry desert, right? Nothing, no life there at all, no water whatsoever. And what does he do? Allah commands him to leave his child and his wife there, his new bride and his newly born child, whom he had waited for so many years to have. And yet Allah tells him, drop him off there and leave. What does he do? What kind of moral fortitude does it take? What kind of dedication to Allah does it take to sacrifice your own wife and your child? In modern standards, people would say, well, that's nuts, that's crazy, that's outright cruel. But his belief in Allah, his belief in the mercy of Allah, his belief that Allah would not leave them without helping them is what allowed him to trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to leave them there, and surely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would then bring out a spring from the earth that we know today as Zamzam. And this would be why all of the people, all of the tribes from around that area would end up coming to this area and building this area to later on become what we know today as Mecca. It was that moral fortitude, that dedication to Allah, the courage to believe and to trust in Allah Almighty is what made an act that normally would be seen, a lowly act by leaving a defenseless child and wife alone in the desert, right, to becoming an act of heroism, right, an act of moral fortitude because of his dedication and belief and trust in Allah Almighty. Not only that, we find that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam later on, after his son became strong, right? After now Prophet Ismail was now to his own, you would think Prophet Ibrahim would now give him the reins, right? But Allah, what does he command him to do? After the Kaaba is built, he says, now I want you to sacrifice your son in my name. Wow, that's completely mind-blowing, right? Now he's tested again. He's tested again with his most beloved child. And what does he do? He's worried. But even though he feels that this might be something that's going to change his life as he knows it, and yet he goes up to his son and he says, my Lord has commanded me to do this. And Ismail alayhi salam, notice the dedication of this prophet, right? What does he say? He says, oh Allah, dear father, I have seen a dream in which Allah has told me of what will happen, and I give myself in sacrifice to him, right? Do what He commanded you to do. And when he does so, as he does so, Allah calls upon him and says to him, stop. And what does he give in his place? فَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِكَبْشٍ عَظِيمٍ, right? That what happens, Allah gives and gives this sheep as an offering, this lamb as an offering to show him that you have shown true dedication and commitment to me. True selflessness and sacrifice. If you are willing to sacrifice your own child, right, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that is a true act of loyalty. There is no greater act of loyalty and commitment and dedication, right? And perseverance, right? And resilience, right? So let's move on then to Prophet Musa alayhi salam. We find that Prophet Musa sacrificed his own wealth, right? I mean, he was raised in the house of whom? Of Pharaoh himself, right? Of Pharaoh himself. He could have had everything, and yet he chose the path less traveled. He chose the path of standing against Pharaoh, the man who was considered to be the greatest tyrant of his time, who had the greatest power in his time. And what does he do? He decides to stand for truth. He decides to stand against this man. He even is exiled as a result, but he returns again in the face of Pharaoh with great courage. The priests, he challenges them, he beats them, right? He comes out showing his moral fortitude because he adhered to his moral compass. And by doing so, he listened to the command of Allah and he followed through until what did Allah do for him? He parted the Red Sea. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does for those who dedicate themselves to him. He parts the ocean for his believers. He makes that one person a source of mercy, a source of salvation for all those that follow him and believe in his cause, in the cause of Allah, in that moral compass that's essential. What do we also find? We find, for example, Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam in the Holy Quran. He's He was sacrificed by his own brothers, right? An act of selfishness. Notice how one sacrifices something that's beloved to them, right? Versus one who sacrifices something that is hated to them. Notice his brothers, they sacrificed Yusuf, but they turned themselves into zeros, not heroes, by doing this. Why? Because it was an act of selfishness. It wasn't an act of selflessness. It was not an act of courage. It was an act of cowardice, right? It was not an act of moral fortitude, right? It wasn't an act of mercy. It was an act of oppression. And so we find that those who think of themselves alone, those who are selfish and think of their own needs and wants, those that value the wrong things. Because surely if they believed in Allah, right, and didn't believe in shaitan that swayed them and moved them to such a criminal act, that they would have seen the reality of things. And so we find the opposite of becoming a hero, the opposite characteristics are exactly why someone becomes selfish as opposed to selfish. Selfish as opposed to selfless, I should say, afwan, right? One that becomes greedy as opposed to being generous, right? One that becomes miserly as opposed to having an open hand and giving and being giving, right? We find then one, instead of being chivalrous, they become someone who is cowardly. And so instead of being gallantry, they end up being fearful. Once we understand this, we understand the formula. We see that Allah gives us examples of the Holy Quran. It becomes clear to us that Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, who would say and ask to be imprisoned just to prevent himself and others from falling into acts of haram. When Zulaykha and the other women were attracted to him, and he knew that there was no way that he would be able to save them and save himself from falling into haram. Of course, he's a prophet of Allah. He knows, he's dedicated to Allah Almighty. He's not going to sacrifice his relationship with Allah. So what does he do? He said he prefers to be imprisoned rather than to be the cause of others falling into haram. Look at the level of sacrifice. In the next example I want to take is the example of Ahl al-Bayt. I've taken 3 prophets, right? 4 prophets actually, and there are so many more. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ أَحْسَنَ الْقَصَصِ. Allah says, we give you the best of stories. Look at what we can learn from these beautiful stories of sacrifice. They give us a formula for what it is that we should do, right? If we put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost, in times of tragedy, in times of calamity, right? In times of distress, if we dedicate ourselves to Him and to He alone, and we become empathetic, then it becomes easy to sacrifice. Then a sacrifice doesn't even become a sacrifice, right? It becomes just an act of moral fortitude. What we also find is in the chapter of Al-Insan, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a great moral example in As-Sayyidah Fatima and Amir al-Mu'mineen and Al-Hasan wal-Husayn alayhim afdal as-salatu was-salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in chapter 76, verses 8 to 12, He says, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا. We give you from our food because we want the pleasure of Allah. We want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't want any thanks from you. We don't want any gratitude from you at all. إِنَّا نَخَافُ مِنْ رَبِّنَا يَوْمًا عَبُوسًا قَمْطَرِيرًا. Surely we fear from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a day in which we will be punished, or people are punished. فَوَقَاهُمُ اللَّهُ شَرَّ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ وَلَقَّاهُمْ نَضْرَةً وَسُرُورًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected them from that day for this great act that they gave of feeding those who are in need. Who, in chapter 8, Allah mentions, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. For the love of Allah, they give food to the impoverished, the destitute, to the orphan, and to those who have been imprisoned, prisoners of war. Allah then says, وَجَزَاهُمْ بِمَا صَبَرُوا جَنَّةً وَحَرِيرًا. And because they were patient, right? They had the moral fortitude to be patient and to be selfless and to sacrifice from what they have. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected them. We find in Ali ibn Ibrahim, the exegete who authored the book Tafsir al-Qummi, he mentions a hadith in which Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salamullahi alayhi explains these verses. He says that the Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, she had some barley and she ended up preparing it and making it into bread. And when the bread was ready for them to eat, a destitute person knocked on the door, an impoverished person. And he said, Rahimakumullah, at'imuni mimma razaqkumullah. May Allah have mercy upon you. Feed me from that which Allah has given you. And Amir al-Mu'mineen salamullahi alayhi took a third of that bread that they had and he gave it to that destitute person. After that, as they were sitting again to try to eat, someone else knocks on their door. And that orphan says, Rahimakumullah, at'imuni mimma razaqkumullah. May Allah have mercy upon you from that which Allah has given you. What happens then? We find that Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi cuts another third of the bread that he had for him and for his wife and his children, and he gives it to the orphan. And the next thing that happens is they're about to sit down again and eat, and the door is knocked again, and Amir al-Mu'mineen gets up to see who it is, and the man says, this turns out it was someone who was a prisoner of war that had been released, and he said to them, Rahimakumullah, at'imuni mimma razaqkumullah. May Allah have mercy upon you, feed me from that which Allah has bestowed on you from sustenance. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen takes the last third and he gives it to this POW, to this prisoner of war. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then reveals the verse, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا, that they feed others out of love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the destitute or impoverished, the orphan and the prisoner. So this gives us a formula. In order for me to be at that level, right? I have to be known as the type of person that people can come to, right? Because notice these three people, they didn't go anywhere else, right? All of these, one after the other, they came and they knocked on the door of Sayyidah Fatima and Ali ibn Abi Talib, because they know that in order for someone to give you, you must ask those who are considered to be generous, known for their generosity, known for their selflessness, known for their ability to sacrifice what is important to them for the good of others, right? So then we understand that in order for us to be a hero, we have to not only sacrifice, we have to sacrifice all the time. We can't be just selfless once and say that's enough. We have to be selfless all the time, right? Because if we are selfless, if we sacrifice all the time, then we will be known for that. We don't do it for others. We don't do it for status, right? We don't do it so that we receive a post in government or a high paying job. We do it because of the fact that it pleases Allah, because we value Allah, right? Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, he said, surely I did not worship you, O Allah, because I fear your fire. Neither did I worship you because I want your reward, but I worshipped you because I found you worthy of worship, right? And when you reach that level of iman, it becomes easy to sacrifice, because you realize how generous Allah has been with all of his creations, how he's given worth to all of his creations, and therefore you follow suit, right? It becomes a simple formula. We follow suit, right? And so it becomes easy for us to sacrifice, because we say, look, Allah gave us. Just as he gave us once, he will give us again. Right? And so if I take from my wealth, it's not my wealth. I realize that it is from the wealth of Allah. And so I give to others. When I give from my time, I realize I haven't sacrificed my time. I've given from the time that Allah has afforded me. And if Allah has given me time, then surely I can afford to give from my time to others, as long as I give it in the way of Allah. That becomes an act of dedication to Allah. It becomes a selfless act, because you are giving to others from what Allah has bestowed upon you, with the trust that Allah will give you more, that Allah will reward you, because Allah sees everything that we do. We find in the narrations of Ahlul Bayt that there's this wonderful formula that speaks of sacrifice. So now we have the key. The key then to becoming a hero is sacrifice, right? According to what we've seen so far, Islamically speaking, every single situation in which a prophet rose above his peers, Ahl al-Bayt rose above everybody else, it was all an act of sacrifice. Imam Hussein salamullahi alayhi would not be in our memory today, right, known to be a hero if it wasn't for the sacrifice that he gave on the land of Karbala. He sacrificed not only himself, he sacrificed his family. We find that Imam Ali salamullah alayhi, he says, Al-Itharu a'la al-makarim. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. Surely I was sent for no other reason than to complete the best of your manners. Imam Ali tells us here how to complete the best of our manners. If we are able to have this quintessential characteristic, then we will have fulfilled makarim al-akhlaq, the highest of manners. What is that? He says al-ithar. He says sacrifice. Sacrifice is the loftiest, the highest level of akhlaq. He also says, if I want to be of al-muhsinin, right? If I want to be of those who are muhsinin, meaning those who are righteous and give righteously, then I have to have sacrifice. Amir al-Mu'mineen says as well, al-itharu a'la al-ihsan, which means that if I want to have makarim al-akhlaq, then I have to be of those who are righteous in my deeds, are righteous in their deeds. As long as I'm righteous in my deeds, then what's going to happen? Then that means that I have reached the highest level of makarim. Not just that, I know that in order for me then, it's a simple formula, right? I know that my goal is to reach the highest level of iman. Dua makarim al-akhlaq, what do I ask for? God says, ask for this. Allahumma balligh mi imani akmal al-iman. Oh Allah, let my iman reach the highest levels of iman, right? The Imam salamullah alayhi, he tells me beautifully, Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, al-itharu ahsanul ihsan. Sacrifice is the best form of righteousness. Al-itharu ahsanul ihsan. And what else? He says, وَأَعْلَى مَرَاتِبِ الْإِيمَانِ. So I want to reach the highest level of iman, then what do I have to do? I have to work on my level of doing good deeds. And there is no greater, more righteous deed than sacrificing something that is endeared to you for the good of others. And so what becomes my goal then is to recognize moments of sacrifice, to recognize when sacrifice is needed, to have the courage to sacrifice, and to have it be out of sincerity to Allah. And that can only be rooted in a state of heightened iman. And that iman must be built on the pillar of yaqeen, of certainty in what Allah has for me, what He has in store for me, not only in this world, but in the hereafter. Once I realize that, then I have truly become a hero. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us heroes in this world and prevents us from being zeros. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to become the type of heroes that Imam al-Hujjah salamullahi alayhi wants around him. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes the calamities from all those who are inflicted by calamities. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows those who are inflicted with calamities to rise above them, to become stronger after them, to prove to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they were surely worthy of this calamity and this tragedy, because they would come out successful on the other side as a result of their dedication and their perseverance, to show their dedication and loyalty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to show their gratitude to Him. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His mercy on our dearly departed, that He gives health to our sick, that He repays the debts of all those in debt. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to be as He wants us to be, and not as we want to be, unless it is truly what He wants us to be. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to realize in the remaining weeks of this holy month the highest levels of iman and sacrifice. For when we sacrifice from our own pockets and from our own food to give to those who are impoverished, then surely there is no greater act of iman. And so I urge you that just like Ahlul Bayt gave to the destitute, then we should give to the destitute. Oh Allah, allow us to give to the destitute, those who are impoverished in this month. There are many who are in need, who aren't making any money during these tough times. Please help us give to them. To give to the orphans, and I highly encourage you to go and give online at alain.org or at alain.ca, as I mentioned before, al-ayn.ca, or al-ayn.co.uk if you're in the UK, or find your local society that gives to the orphans and to the destitute, to your local mosque, right? At MYC, the IIA is a great place for you to be able to give in sadaqah, to give to those who are in need. Go to Zaman International if you're in the Dearborn area. Hajj Najah Bazi and her team, mashallah, these CNN heroes, may Allah bless them all, have dedicated themselves and their lives to helping others as well. Also, the last that we ask is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts what little we offered, right, in this month. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes the oppression from all those oppressed, that He returns the estranged to their homelands, and that all of the mu'mineen are remembered in our dua. I dedicate these series of lectures in the past few days to all of your dearly departed and my dearly departed, from our grandparents and our relatives that are no longer with us, and our community members who have been forgotten for dua. Mu'mineen and mu'minat who don't have any recite Fatiha for them, do dua for them, to dedicate righteous deeds to them. We dedicate these lectures to them all. I dedicate this lecture specifically, as well as other lectures, to my father-in-law who passed away last year, and as well I dedicate it to the mother of my dear brother, brother Atar al-Attar in Houston, as well as to Hajj Abdullah Hamka, who left us last year. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to be as He wants us to be, not as we want to be, unless it's how He wants us to be. I mention this again. Please forgive me for any deficiencies, any taqsir that came from me in these series of lectures. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives all. Inshallah, we can all be forgiving. Thank you so much for hosting me to the MYC. I look forward, inshallah, to listening to the lectures of Sheikh Muhammad al-Sa'di, who's going to follow up after me in the upcoming 2 weeks, inshallah. I highly urge you to listen to him. He's a very good scholar, mashallah. He studied hard in the city of Najaf. He sacrificed, him and his family, in order to gain knowledge of Ahlul Bayt so that they can benefit the communities. And I recognize the wonderful scholars at the MYC, Sayyid Hassan al-Qazwini and his wonderful sons, and Sayyid Muhammad Baqir, Sayyid Ahmad, as well as his nephew Sayyid Saleh, for their dedication to the community and their self-sacrifice, and all those like them around the world. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us all tawfiq in this holy month. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلي يا رب على سيدنا محمد وآل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين والفاتحة على المرحومين مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل